this webinar, which is to discuss the outputs on the Expert Advisory Committee on Developing Global Standards for Governance and Oversight of Human Genome Editing, which reported its findings to the DG in July. And I don't think it's exaggerating to you to call this a real leap forward in this rapidly emerging science. However, before I go on in English, as my Spanish is very poor, can I draw your attention to the fact we do have simultaneous translation to and from Spanish available. So if you click the little globe at the bottom of the Zoom window, you'll be able to access that, and you can pick us up in then either English or Spanish as you wish. Thanks. So I want to start by saying that this is not an isolated topic, and addressing topics like this is an integral part of the WHO transformation that saw the creation of the new science division. The idea being to get WHO ahead of the curve on science, and the intent not simply to respond to new health technologies, but to actually engage early and help to shape them so they benefit all. Human genome editing is a great example of an emerging scientific technology that offers huge potential benefits for health, but presents novel scientific issues and has generated considerable community concern. Member states are looking to WHO to advise them on how to tackle this issue and how to move forward responsibly in this area. We've been lucky because we've had a fantastic committee of 18 experts from all WHO regions working for almost 2 years in this area, wonderfully chaired by Peggy Hamburg and Edwin Cameron. And you're going to hear directly from some of the members of this committee today about some of the key questions they've addressed, the recommendations they've made. The DG is absolutely committed to acting on this report, not just reading it, but acting upon it. And is charged us internally with working across all levels of the organization in an integrated approach to implementation. However, the report also recognizes the burden does not all lie with WHO, and it calls for a collaborative approach with all stakeholders and engagement with the wider community. So thanks once more for your attendance at the event, especially given that the next stage of this work will really need to focus on implementation and understanding the different regional and country perspectives and needs if we want to take this forward successfully. So I'll now pass on to Carla Sens, the Regional Bioethics Advisor from PAHO. Carla, over to you.
Thank you very much, John, and all our colleagues from WHO that have worked not only making these reports possible, but also this session. I mean, Catherine Littler and Emmanuel Turlings. Voy a cambiar a español ahora. Soy Carla Sáenz, soy asesora regional de bioética y es un gusto para el Programa Regional de Bioética de la OPS retomar la reflexión ética sobre la edición del genoma humano. Nuestra región ha estado muy activa en este diálogo. Recordarán que en el 2019 hemos tenido una serie de 5 webinars sobre el tema con distintos expertos de la región. En el 2020 hemos contribuido a las consultas de la OMS, haciendo incluso traducción de las contribuciones que fueron llegadas en español. Y en el 2021, en mayo, retomamos los webinars con una conversación sobre los aspectos de comunicación en la ética y la edición genética. Este es un tema de suma importancia para la región y estas actividades se han debido a que creemos que es crucial que participemos en este diálogo global. A la luz del rol de nuestra región y específicamente de Latinoamérica y el Caribe en la reflexión global sobre la edición genética, quisiéramos en este momento tomar un momento para honrar a nuestra colega Ana Sánchez Urrutia, que fue miembro del Comité Asesor Experto establecido por la OMS para hacer los estándares globales para la gobernanza y la edición del genoma humano, y ciertamente fue la única persona que representaba a Latinoamérica y el Caribe. Ana falleció tempranamente el pasado agosto. Ella fue una gran colaboradora del Programa Regional de Bioética y tuvo un gran liderazgo en la bioética en Panamá. Fue capaz de conciliar la actividad académica en bioética con la práctica y el ejercicio de la bioética. Ella estuvo muy honrada de ser parte del Comité de Edición Genética de la OMS, y recuerdo que me contó que en una entrevista que le hicieron para la televisión, Le preguntaron muy cándidamente por qué a los panameños les habría de interesar la edición genética. Ella respondió con un ejemplo. Ella contó que uno de los usos de edición genética que se está estudiando es para curar la anemia falciforme que afecta a muchos panameños. Dice que luego de haber dado ese ejemplo, la percepción cambió y se abrieron paso en muchas conversaciones sobre la edición genética. Dejó de ser un tema como de Marte para ser algo que le interesaba a la gente. A todos nos habría de interesar la edición genética. E indudablemente la ética de la edición genética hereditable supone un involucramiento de la sociedad. Ana dio un paso importante para motivar este involucramiento y es tarea de todos nosotros seguir adelante. Y siguiendo adelante con el programa, nos acompañan dos miembros del comité, la profesora Françoise Bailey de Dalhousie University en Canadá y el doctor Jamie Metzel del Atlantic Council y One Shared World. Ellos van a presentar el reporte que luego discutiremos. Muchas gracias.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today in what I hope will be an engaging intervention. It's an opportunity for us to very briefly share with you a summary of the work, and then we're hopeful that you'll engage in conversation with us. What you see on the slide right now is the list of committee members, and as you can see, a fair bit of diversity around the world. And again, I want to express our condolences to Anna's family. Many committee members were deeply grateful for her contributions and saddened by her passing. Next slide, please. The work of the committee spanned a couple of years and was extremely comprehensive. We had a number of face-to-face meetings. On occasion, the group as a whole would break up into subgroups so that we could work on particular areas of interest. Owing to the pandemic, we were able to turn, if you will, to benefit from the opportunity of online consultations, which we were able to do. And one of the things you'll hear about in this presentation is the Human Genome Editing Registry. And one of the things that's very important about that is that it came into play as a pilot even before our final reports were released. We had 2 satellite meetings. These were meetings hosted in conjunction with other established meetings, and 2 online consultations on the governance framework. Next slide, please. One of the things to appreciate in the report is the scope of the topic. The specific charge from the Director General was to address somatic, germline, and heritable genome editing. And you can see on the slide a very brief description of the scope of those 3 areas of work and research. The charge from the Director General was also broad in that we were asked to address scientific, ethical, and social issues of governance, and to do this on a global scale. One of the things that was particularly challenging, given the broad scope, was paying attention to the likely different time horizons for this kind of research moving from the lab into the real world at the bedside. So, somatic genome editing, of the kind you've already heard mention of with the example of sickle cell disease, is currently happening. We are in clinical trials, and the hope is that this research will be successful and will move into the possibility of therapeutic applications. Germline editing, which is the research happening in the lab with things like egg, sperm, their precursor cells, and early embryos, is currently happening and expanding. The important difference between germline and heritable is that it's the same basic science, but with heritable human genome editing, the material that has been genetically altered is transferred to a uterus for reproduction. So that's the scope of the report. Next slide, please. One of the things that's really important to appreciate about the work of the committee is that we did not work in isolation and then at the end of several years, simply issue a report. Early on, the committee determined that it was important to have information about what research was actually happening. And so there was a proposal for a clinical trials registry, and that came online long before the final report was issued. Along the way, the committee heard rumors and then learned in some publications that there were plans for going forward with the kind of research that I have described for you as heritable human genome editing. The committee made a recommendation to the Director General to issue a statement, and the Director General did so. This was in July of 2019, where he made a statement that it would be irresponsible to use genetically altered embryos for reproduction. Most recently, in July 2021, we have in fact been able to publish our work. One of the important things is the governance framework. And then we have a separate document that lists 9 explicit recommendations for governance and oversight. And we'll be talking about that work now. Next slide, please. We've used what's called a framework approach, and our goal here has been to identify a range of issues and to try to identify a number of mechanisms that could usefully help us to address these issues. An overarching goal was to make sure that the framework would be what we determine as scalable, sustainable, and appropriate for use at the institutional, national, regional, and environmental levels. In other words, we need to have mechanisms that can work in all parts of the world, including parts of the world where there's traditionally weaker regulation of scientific and clinical research and practice. So again, the overarching goal is to provide individuals, organizations with tools and guidance. Next slide, please. This shows you just the structure of the governance framework. It is available on the web, and I encourage you to have a look at the framework. It's a long document by some standards, a short document by others. I'd like to believe that it's reasonably comprehensive and thus helpful. Next slide, please. One of the things that's very important in developing a governance framework is to have an understanding of the background situation or conditions. And one of the things that's important to appreciate is that we're not starting with a blank slate. The rules for research in the area of germline and heritable interventions differ around the world. What you see here is a snapshot in time. This was published in October 2020. There have since been a few changes, and this shows the different policy situations in a variety of countries, specifically for germline editing. That's the research happening in the lab. Next slide. Notice here, again, the rules differ around the world, and here the map is representing policy for heritable human genome editing. This is when the research moves from the lab into a clinical setting for the purpose of reproduction. Next slide. The governance framework is grounded in ethical values and principles. And I think one of the things that's especially important to appreciate here is that we looked at what would be described as procedural values and principles and substantive values and principles. On the left-hand side, you see the list of principles that are to inform how decisions are made. And on the other side, the list of values and principles that are supposed to inform what decisions are made. The important message here is that we took these values and principles and essentially drag them through the document and refer back to them repeatedly, stating, given that we care about these specific values and principles, these are the kinds of recommendations we're able to make. Next slide, please. One of the things that we do in this framework is try to address human genome editing research in a number of different domains. One of the things we looked at is somatic human genome editing. And as you can see here, we've identified the fact that this research can happen postnatally, meaning in humans that walk amongst us, but also prenatally, an intervention on the fetus in utero. Also concerns about heritable human genome editing, where we would be creating humans with select traits, human genetic editing, and human enhancement. Next slide, please. One of the other important things about the governance framework is that we encourage individuals, organizations, governments, policymakers to understand that a framework can be much more than typical legal mechanisms. And so it's not just declarations, treaties, legislation. It's not just judicial rulings or ministerial decrees, but there are many other ways, in fact, through which we are able to regulate the practice of science. And you see here, I think, a very interesting, though probably not comprehensive list. But the point here is to say that there are many ways in which we can try to govern human genome editing. Next slide, please. Another thing that we did, because the goal was to be helpful, was not only to list a number of possible tools, mechanisms, values, and principles, but also to provide a number of possible scenarios. And the idea here is to actually demonstrate how the elements of our governance framework could come together in practice. And so the scenarios actually illustrate a number of practical challenges. They ask questions about how one might resolve these challenges. They point to the values and principles that might come into play. And so, for example, we explore different facets of the governance puzzle: regulation, inclusiveness, equitable access, etc. For us, in the context of working on these scenarios, it really became a useful tool to test the utility of the governance framework. And so what you had here is a little bit of what I would describe as a dialectical process. The scenarios allowed us to improve our foundational ideas. Our foundational ideas allowed us to help address challenges in the scenarios. Next slide, please. The scenarios are in a number of different areas, but one of the things I draw to your attention is the preponderance of scenarios addressing somatic human genome editing. The reason for this is, you'll recall, I mentioned earlier that there's a difference in terms of the timeline or the horizon for this research moving from a lab or a research environment into a clinical context. And it's somatic human genome editing that is likely to be most useful in the immediate near term. And in that context, you'll see a number of scenarios. One looking at clinical trials for sickle cell disease, another at clinical trials for Huntington's disease. But in that context, we then also were very worried about the premature offering of certain kinds of interventions. And so we have a case involving unscrupulous entrepreneurs and clinics. And we have an early case looking at the move from anything that might be thought of as therapeutic to enhancement. And the illustration here is with respect to athletic ability. There's a case on heritable human genome editing, and also a case on prenatal in utero somatic human genome editing. Next slide, please. And at this point, I'm going to hand this over to my colleague, Jamie, who's going to take you through each of these recommendations in turn. The one general point I would make is that all of the first 8 recommendations are directly in response to the mandate given to the committee by the Director General. And I think that one of the things that becomes important is that last one, the 8th one, which is to actually take the work on ethical values and principles and use it beyond the topic of human genome editing. Over to you, Jamie.
Thanks so much, Francoise, and thank you, Carla and John, and thank you to all of you for being here and what we believe is a really important conversation. Before I go through the recommendations briefly, I just want to start where John began, which is highlighting that we are at a pretty significant inflection point for our human habitation on Earth, because our technologies are becoming incredibly powerful. The rate of increase, the rate of expansion of our technologies is exponential. And what we're struggling with is a mismatch between our exponential technologies and our cultural and governance and regulatory environments, which aren't moving as quickly. And what that does is it changes a little bit, or even significantly, the way that we need to think about governance. Because if the governance structures are too slow to develop, the gulf between the technological capabilities and the governance systems, defined broadly as Francois just described, will be too great, and there'll be a lot of bad things that can happen in that space, which is including unethical scientific activities, but also a loss of faith among the general public and publics in how our governing institutions can function at all levels. And that really informed the work that we were doing. And that's why John's initial point that this is connected to the broader realm of frontier science and technology. And that's really important. So next slide, please. I'll go through our recommendations relatively quickly. The first is that we all know that the World Health Organization is an absolutely essential organization in the world, but it doesn't have any really significant control over national states. And so because of that, the role of the WHO and its Director General to set an agenda, to try to help push along our process of articulating norms and standards, we believe is particularly important. And that's why our first recommendation was that the WHO and the Director General are very open about the opportunities and challenges in human genome editing. It's easy to go to one extreme or the other. This is all negative or it's all positive, but the truth of the matter is that there is a very positive story here, but there are very significant potential downsides, and our goal is to optimize the upsides and minimize any potential harms. And the agenda setting and the norm setting of the WHO and the DG is critical. But that's why articulating and discussing the ethical issues really at every level continuously are critically important. And also outlining the downsides, being honest about failures, including in very powerful nation states is very important. Next slide, please. As this stresses what Francoise has already said, international collaboration is absolutely essential for effective governance and oversight. And because of that, we believe that the WHO should collaborate with other international bodies, and we list them, and that the WHO and the DG can play a critically important role in instituting a cross-institutional approach, which brings together member states, which brings together different international organizations. And the good news is that the WHO already has a framework for doing that. We don't feel that we need to quote unquote reinvent the wheel. What we need to do is ask, what are the most relevant structures that exist, and how can we make sure that we maximally use those to address this in part new set of technologies and technological challenges. And that's why the science division, which also reflects that, we believe is critically important to this process. And that's why we've called on the DG to task the science division to convene a series of meetings, including with each of the 6 WHO regional offices, regulators, medical and scientific leaders, patient groups, civil society organizations, and other relevant bodies. This is the kind of issue where we need to move forward together and in an inclusive manner. And that means from the beginning. It's not that we, whether it's government leaders or the WHO, present findings to society. We really need to empower and engage at every level. Next slide, please. Francoise mentioned this. One of our first recommendations was the establishment of human genome editing registries. And we discussed this quite a bit over the 2 years. And it was really helpful that the WHO could begin a pilot project while our task force, our experts group was still convened. We think it's very, very important because information will allow not just regulatory bodies, but universities, hospitals, even the general public to be able to have informed conversation about what should and should not be happening. And again, this is not a thing where we or anyone, I believe, is saying human genome editing in every conceivable circumstance is wrong and should be banned. What we're saying is certainly we're not ready for it now, but very likely, in my personal view, there will come a time when we will be ready for it, at least in some limited ways. And at that time, there needs to be maximal transparency, and which will allow, if we have the right infrastructures in place, for a balancing at every level of the risks and benefits of every conceivable intervention. Next slide, please. International research and medical travel, we believe is critically important. We've seen with so many other technologies that international research can be an opportunity to go to places where there aren't strong regulatory infrastructures and do things that would not be possible in a home environment. And so we were very mindful about raising cautions about that. In medical travel, I think we've all seen with unethical stem cell research that often happens in places that are regulatory black holes, that there's a real danger, because what we're talking about is not just systemic interventions for the individual, but we're also talking about systemic interventions that can at least in a small way in the beginning, but even less small ways over time, change the evolutionary trajectory of our species. And because of that, we really need to think of a one world approach. And so we need to look carefully at international research and medical travel. Next slide. Illegal, unregistered, unethical, or unsafe research and other activities. I'm just going to read this one because it's particularly important and technical. But we believe that the WHO, with advice from the New Science Council, should charge the Science Division to lead an effort to create a multi-sector collaboration to develop an accessible mechanism for confidential reporting of concerns about possibly illegal, unregistered, unethical, and unsafe human genome editing research and other activities. That it's critically important. As I said, where these technologies are extremely powerful, and transparency and accountability will be the key, not just to effective governance, but making sure that we can move forward together in ways that maintain public trust in our institutions, in our science, and that we can develop applications of these technologies that are helpful to people and avoid the kinds of harms that we've already seen. Next slide, please. Intellectual property is particularly important. We also believe that it creates some additional levers that could effectively be used to promote the most ethical and appropriate application of these technologies. That's why we believe that in collaboration with other international organizations, the World Intellectual Property Organization, the WTO, and others, the WHO should encourage relevant patent holders to help ensure equitable access to human genome editing interventions, but not just equitable access, also the ethical application of these technologies, norm setting and holding meetings and in that process, we believe are really important, because we're now seeing with the vaccines how intellectual property plays a very important role in determining who has access to what and at what time. Next slide, please. Education, engagement, and empowerment is something I personally, and I know Francoise and many of us felt was very, very important. These technologies are so powerful and so significant for all of us, for everyone on Earth, that it's not enough for even the most well-meaning scientists and government officials to make decisions on behalf of everybody. But if we want to have inclusive decision-making, we need to make that possible. And that's why education, engagement are critically important to empower people to join the conversation. But empowerment is equally important, because this isn't just sharing information. People at all levels need to be part of the decision-making process. So they need to be empowered to do so, And we need to make sure that we have structures in place where the voices of everyone can be heard. And particularly, it's a challenge because there are many people around the world who don't even have access to digital means of communication, but reaching everybody and engaging everybody and empowering everybody is critically important to moving forward together. Next slide, please. Ethical values and principles for use by the WHO. As we went through our work, it became clear that what we were trying to do was articulate a broader set of ethical values and principles that could guide what we were doing. And it was clear that every other WHO convened expert group was in one way or another doing the same thing. And so while I think we all feel we know what the WHO stands for, we believe it would be important to codify that into a set of values and principles that would guide the work of all of these types of expert advisory groups. That doesn't mean that it would be set in stone, but that articulating it would be a very important starting point for future efforts. Next slide, please. So this is just a list of some of those ethical values and principles, and these we believe are critically important, but they could change over time, and that's why we need to have an ongoing process. But ethics and values, certainly the advance of science and the application of this science in China and perhaps elsewhere was the impetus for the establishment of our committee. But what our committee was ultimately about was the application of ethical values and principles to this revolutionary science. And we believe to all revolutionary science. And that's why, while this is a start, we believe there's a great deal of work to be done going forward. So I'll just stop there, but let me say the official, I've done a lot of my own personal commentary in what I've just described. Please refer to the report for our official positions. But now this report is complete, and we're going to have a regular review process. We've called on that. But we really feel it's up to all of you, certainly in the WHO regional centers, and the people who are receiving the report and the ideas, to make these ideas your own, to be part of this conversation about the best ways forward. So thank you so much, and let me stop there.
Muchas gracias, Jamie. Vamos a dar paso, muchas gracias, Françoise. Vamos a dar paso ahora a la discusión regional, y la primera parte de esta sección está a cargo de Sofía Salas. Sofía es profesora del Centro de Bioética de la Universidad del Desarrollo, Facultad de Medicina de la Clínica Alemana en Chile, que es uno de los centros colaboradores para bioética de la OPS y OMS, además de una gran colaboradora nuestra. Sofía, gracias por participar en esta discusión, y te paso la palabra. Colegas, les agradezco que vayan compartiendo sus preguntas usando la función de preguntas y respuestas.
Muchas gracias, Carla, por haberme dado la oportunidad de presentar algunos de los temas de discusión que a nivel regional hemos considerado importante en relación al framework que ha propuesto el WHO. Este documento explora 5 desafíos, de los cuales ustedes ya han escuchado: edición genética humana a nivel postnatal, somática, fetal, también somática, heredable, que afecta la línea germinal, y también incluye edición epigenética y enhancement o mejora. Y he puesto en azul estos dos últimos porque en realidad podría haber el uso de esta técnica con fines de enhancement, ya sea a nivel fetal o de línea germinal, no necesariamente o exclusivamente a nivel de células germinales. Pero el problema, a mi juicio, es lo que nosotros en la región llamamos, cuando se mezclan peras y manzanas, muchas veces se pierde el foco de cuál es el problema ético más relevante, que tal vez por ahora corresponde a la edición génica humana heredable con fines reproductivos. Y por lo tanto, creemos que es mejor separar el ámbito de aplicación y sus objetivos porque desde el punto de vista de ética e investigación tiene consideraciones específicas. Si se hace investigación en células somáticas, haciendo edición génica, a nuestro juicio, las consideraciones éticas son semejantes a cualquier otra investigación de una técnica novedosa, con especial énfasis en la valoración del riesgo, balance-beneficio, porque obviamente como la técnica no es muy conocida todavía, los riesgos potenciales son mayores. Y lo mismo ocurre cuando se hace edición genética a nivel fetal, que son células somáticas, porque puede ser usada para resolver graves enfermedades y por lo tanto es fundamental, entre otros aspectos, tener un foco en cuán grave es la condición que se pretende reparar para así ver si los riesgos son proporcionados. En cambio, en la edición genética de células germinales, si esta es sin fines reproductivos, no es muy distinto a las consideraciones éticas cuando se hace investigación en embriones humanos. En cambio, cuando es con fines reproductivos, tiene consecuencias en futuras generaciones. Y estando una técnica que todavía no está 100% segura, por supuesto que tiene consideraciones éticas adicionales. Pero en cualquiera de estas situaciones, la edición genética humana puede usarse para resolver graves enfermedades, para prevención de enfermedades o para enhancement. Entonces el problema es qué técnica uso, si es en línea heredable o si es a nivel somático y cuál es el objetivo de la técnica. En la parte del documento del WHO sobre los desafíos éticos en relación a la edición genética en células somáticas, el documento menciona de manera adecuada el problema de las clínicas deshonestas, el turismo o viajes médicos para buscar respuestas que no se encuentran en el país de origen, la investigación ilegal, no registrada o insegura, o el uso de intervenciones terapéuticas que no han sido probadas y que por lo tanto no son seguras. Pero en realidad estos problemas que señala el documento son compartidos con muchas otras terapias no aprobadas aún. Por ejemplo, terapias en células madre presentan muchas veces las mismas dificultades, o también con tratamientos médicos que no están disponibles en el país de origen o que son muy caros, hacen que las personas vayan a otras partes a resolver sus problemas de salud y no siempre se hace de manera segura. Por lo tanto, estos aspectos que señala el documento para nosotros son compartidos con muchas otras intervenciones y no específicas a un problema de edición genética humana. También, y no me voy a extender en cada uno de los puntos en que uno puede encontrar temas para la discusión. Por ejemplo, señala la necesidad de que exista un registro de investigación en estas nuevas terapias, de tal modo que la WHO asegure que los ensayos clínicos que usan edición genética humana han sido revisados y aprobados por comités de ética antes de ser incluidos en este registro. Y propone, entre otras cosas, identificar palabras clave, que exista un comité de monitoreo para ver si se están llevando a cabo estos registros, tanto a nivel básico o preclínico. Pero en realidad uno pudiera preguntarse si es necesario un registro exclusivo o más bien aumentar las exigencias para que todo ensayo clínico en humano esté debidamente registrado. También los expositores han señalado valores comprometidos en la implementación, los cuales son absolutamente compartidos por nosotros, como tema de inclusividad, principio de precaución, justicia social, el que no discrimine, igual valor moral de todas las personas, respeto por las personas, solidaridad, justicia sanitaria global. Pero por cierto, todos estos principios en realidad son valores compartidos con toda investigación en seres humanos y no son exclusivos de la edición genética humana. Hay algunas cuestiones éticas específicas de investigación en células somáticas, pero en realidad el concepto actual ha sido movido desde edición génica a su uso prácticamente como una quimioterapia, otra herramienta más dentro del arsenal terapéutico que puede resolver graves problemas de salud. Y por lo tanto, las consideraciones éticas debieran ser semejantes a toda nueva terapia experimental. El balance riesgo-beneficio favorable, como ya les mencioné, consentimiento informado, justicia en la selección de los sujetos. Y sí hay un aspecto muy importante que lo mencionó Carla en un comienzo y luego en las exposiciones, es de qué manera se contribuye a mejorar la comunicación a nivel poblacional, porque todavía existe en la población el creer que lo genético tiene un poder de sanación mayor, y es bueno aterrizar las expectativas que pudiese tener la población sobre la técnica y también aclarar los falsos temores que muchas veces circulan relacionados con ciencia ficción que ha dado cuenta de la fantasía muchas veces del posible uso de estas técnicas. Y por ahora parece razonable que no sean utilizados para condiciones no médicas, fundamentalmente por el tema de riesgo-beneficio y justicia en una técnica que todavía está en etapa de desarrollo. Pero en realidad la edición génica en células somáticas ya ha avanzado a la etapa clínica y por lo tanto lo que uno debiera tratar de lograr es que cuando se ofrezca esta técnica se haga de manera segura, transparente e idealmente asequible al mayor número de personas que la requieran. Las mismas consideraciones en relación a terapia genética fetal, puesto que al ser en células somáticas, las consecuencias están solo para, en este caso, el feto que recibe la intervención. Y puede ser de enorme utilidad para aquellas enfermedades en las cuales no hay terapia eficaz y que tiene gran morbilidad. Y por lo mismo, su uso a nivel experimental debe mantener las mismas consideraciones en las cuales se permite o no investigación a nivel fetal. En cambio, la edición genética de células germinales, uno pudiera dar una mirada más enfocada. Está aquella que no tiene fines reproductivos y la otra que es con fines reproductivos que podría afectar a la siguiente generación. Si es sin fines reproductivos, a nuestro juicio, las consideraciones éticas serían similares a cualquier investigación en embriones humanos, como mínimo el consentimiento de los progenitores y la pregunta moral si se permite o no la destrucción de embriones humanos. Pero esto es compartido, ya sea que la investigación sea para hacer edición génica, para producir embriones híbridos, para obtener células madre, etc. En cambio, con fines reproductivos, el tema de seguridad de la técnica es relevante porque afecta no solamente al embrión que recibe la intervención, sino que a las futuras generaciones. Y también es donde más cuestionamiento se ha levantado respecto del posible uso más bien de enhancement y no para tratar una condición médica. Y en ese sentido parece adecuado por ahora una moratoria. A modo de conclusión, el problema con toda nueva tecnología, y esta lo es la tensión evidente entre promover la innovación y los deseos de avanzar rápido, con la precaución para promover su eficacia y seguridad que obliga a ir más lento. Y es por esto que la edición genética en línea germinal requiere consideraciones especiales debido al efecto transgeneracional heredable que tiene la técnica. En cambio, cuando se usan células somáticas, ya nacidos o fetos, tendría similares consideraciones éticas a otras investigaciones, por lo que a nuestro juicio no requeriría de una nueva gobernanza, más bien robustecer lo que ya se tiene. Y respecto de línea germinal, dadas las implicancias sociales, éticas, filosóficas y legales, requieren previamente ser discutidas con mayor profundidad. Y aquí quisiéramos enfatizar que creemos que es la sociedad civil, no solo los científicos o los líderes, ya sea del WHO o de la OPS, quienes finalmente debieran decidir cuál es esa línea límite de lo aceptable y no lo aceptable en el uso de estas nuevas tecnologías. Y la comunidad científica, con el apoyo de los organismos tan importantes como el WHO, debieran garantizar que la investigación y su aplicación en seres humanos sea responsable y segura. Como palabras de cierre, algunas extraídas del mismo documento, del framework, en que en un mundo diverso, los países y regiones, en consideración a sus aspectos culturales, históricos y religiosos, van a optar por distintas aproximaciones regulatorias sobre esta materia, por lo que es importante identificar correctamente los valores y principios que orientan las decisiones. Y, a modo de sugerencia, enfocar la gobernanza del WHO donde realmente se requiere. Muchísimas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Sofía, por esta presentación que realmente toca muchos temas muy sentidos en Latinoamérica y el Caribe, y creo que en la región de las Américas en general. Quiero invitar a todos a Catherine Litter de la Unidad de Ética de la OMS, a Françoise y a Jamie también a unirse al diálogo. No tenemos mucho tiempo, pero creo que hay varias preguntas que ya se están respondiendo y quizás lo mejor para iniciar es darle la oportunidad a los miembros del comité que respondan. Hay muchas preguntas que ha levantado Sofía en la discusión que resuenan con comentarios de la audiencia sobre, por ejemplo, el trato tanto de los temas de las células germinales como la edición genética somática como la de las células, las líneas germinales, y también algunos temas. Me doy cuenta que las preguntas, al no estar todas en inglés, ustedes no las entienden todas. Hay una pregunta que Françoise indicó que iba a responder sobre ethics dumping, y hay otra relacionada en español sobre cómo se garantiza que el beneficio de las investigaciones sea también accesible a personas y países de bajos ingresos. Creo que abrimos la conversación ahí y luego vamos agregando nuevos puntos. No sé quién quiere iniciar.
Well, I'm happy to jump in quickly. So thank you so much, Carla. One of the questions that I saw was, how can regular people get involved? It seems so big, and that there are these big issues of science. Then there's a gulf between what's happening in the scientific world, and even with a small number of regulators, and normal people who don't have that kind of background. And for that, one of the things that we can do is look at countries and environments that do a particularly good job of public engagement and ask, well, what are the questions that we can learn? And that was one of the areas that we focused on in our deliberations. And we heard from the Danish bioethics community, and they have a really fantastic model in Denmark of having highly informed public consultations on very complex scientific issues that have done an excellent job of bringing people in to these conversations. And I believe it's not coincidental that now Denmark is having one of the most effective responses to COVID-19, including because there's a very informed and engaged public that has been brought into the conversation and the process. So we certainly believe that there are structural mechanisms that can be set in place that are empowering, and that's an area where the World Health Organization has a critically important role to play of bringing together these kinds of best practices, and the regional offices also are essential in taking these bigger ideas and helping countries and communities tailor them to their needs.
And if I can, I'll just jump in with respect to the other question about ethics dumping. And I want to assure everyone that this was a topic that was discussed at great length by the committee. Certainly in the context of governance, we were aware of what we might describe as policy gaps. We were also aware that there are differentials between different countries around the world, both in terms of the kinds of research they want to pursue, but also the kinds of research they want to permit. And also in that context, you will have seen that one of the recommendations, and Jamie spoke to this in the slide presentation, was about what to do when you have information about activities that you believe are illegal or unethical or harmful, et cetera. At the end of the day, a number of possible, specific mechanisms were discussed. But the recommendation to WHO was that in the short term, that it could perhaps serve, if you will, as a concierge. That may not be the right term, but the idea is that it would be a place where concerns could be reported. And then the WHO, which has no authority in terms of actually trying to resolve those issues, would then be able, hopefully, to get it to the right address. At this point, I think we recognize that it is a complicated issue, largely because we are dealing with a complicated policy environment and also a complicated multicultural world. So I think the report acknowledges that this is an issue, this is a problem. It does have to do with power differentials. It does have to do with capacity within different countries and regions, and we don't want to walk away from it. The other thing that we do specifically emphasize is the importance of having mechanisms that protect those who want to come forward and actually make an allegation or report a concern. So there was concern there that the mechanisms be fair, that they be accountable, etc. So that may not be the solution, but I don't think anyone has an obvious solution. I think our work was to name it, to legitimize it, to find a specific role for WHO to receive that information as a non-interested party in the strict sense of having vested interests, and for WHO to get that information to the right address.
Thank you so much. I don't know if Catherine, you want to add something on your end on WHO's plan to move forward specifying and clarifying ethical guidelines for germline for heritable gene editing.
I'm sorry, I missed the beginning of that question because I had my translation device on.
Sorry. I'm sorry. I forgot. That's my fault. So one of the questions that we received is what is WHO's plan to move forward specifying and clarifying ethical guidelines for germline heritable gene editing? So I was wondering if you wanted to comment on that.
I'll offer a first remark, but I'm sure Jamie will want to weigh in. One of the things that you would also have seen in the slide deck is a reference to public education, engagement, and empowerment. And in large part, that was a messaging to the WHO to say that the work does not end with the tabling, if you will, of final reports. And you've also heard from Jamie that WHO's Director General has not only listened and received our recommendations, but has said that he will act on those recommendations. So I think a beginning part of that is having these kinds of conversations, webinars, making members of the committee available to different communities that have an interest, continuing to hear back. But yes, the goal is to have this be an ongoing conversation. And you'll also remember that one of the last recommendations was to say that this work should be reviewed on a cyclical basis. And so that was very much to make sure that this doesn't sort of just end up on someone's bookshelf.
And I'll just quickly add to that the reason why our committee existed at all was because of the leadership of the Director General and the senior leadership of the WHO. So they very, very much understand the importance and the urgency of this. but their understanding and our understanding is that our report was just a first step in a much longer journey. And so I think we're all on the same page in that. And that's why the engagement of regional offices is so important. Our report and our work will fail. It will be a failure unless it's seen as a spark for an ongoing process. This isn't a one and done type of activity. It's something where we need to bring more people into the conversation, and the process needs to grow from the conversation, from articulating principles to developing norms and structures and institutions, national laws and other things. But I'd also love to hear Catherine speak to that about the commitment of the WHO for moving forward.
Thanks, Jamie. I'll be quick, Carla, because I'm conscious of time, but I do think it's really important to make the point that these webinars and engagement with regional officers and more widely are critical to our implementation strategy. Not only are we looking to implement the recommendations, but also understand how they're fit for purpose in different settings and where we have to put different emphasis. And that may also mean that there are, as Anna pointed out in her question, do we need to look at additional ethical guidance or additional work in this space? But I think a full understanding of regional and country level needs is a critical step in our implementation. And I think there are some short-term things we can do, and then there are some of the recommendations, medium and longer term, and that's what we need to work out over the next 3 to 6 months. And I'll stop there and back to you, Carla.
Gracias, Catherine. Hay una pregunta también, no sé si hay algo breve que decir al respecto sobre los planes de implementación del registro que se mencionó. Si hay algo breve que pudieras compartir como última palabra para cerrar.
The registry exists right now in what we would call a pilot phase, and this is with respect to clinical applications. And one of the recommendations is to think about ways in which that can be made more secure and more robust. So there are limitations at this point, but what is important is that it's available, and the expectation, hope, is that people will voluntarily register the research that they're conducting. If you think back to some of the things we said about the framework and other ways of governance, our hope and expectation is that being included in the registry will be a requirement for publication. That's another way in which you can try to have a broad understanding of governance. At the same time, there's concern that it's not necessarily easy to find everything that should be in the registry, and that there may be things in the registry that shouldn't be there, that people are using this as a way to get themselves some kind of credibility. So I think the point is, right now, it's up and running. It's in a pilot phase. The hope is that it will be made more robust, and in time that it might broaden to other areas of research.
Muchísimas gracias. Estamos ya con la hora. Gracias a todos los panelistas, gracias a todos los participantes, a los traductores que hicieron posible este diálogo a través de 2 idiomas, y a todos los que nos apoyaron en la organización de esta sesión. Esperemos que este sea un paso más en el diálogo regional sobre el tema, y los invitamos a continuar participando en las sesiones, a suscribirse en las listas de bioética de la OPS, donde estamos constantemente compartiendo material y alentando este gran diálogo regional. Muchísimas gracias, buenos días, buenas tardes.
Thanks.